Once in a little village not that far from here, there was a problem. Animals had started dying off one by one. In the morning, their owners would see them lying outside with 10 holes in their chest. The people thought it was the work of their neighboring town, insert name. Then one night, a man by the name of Fred was closing his store for the night. It was very late, and he was anxious to get home to his family. He shut off all the lights, then closed the door with a satisfying click. As he turned around to go to his car, he saw a dark shape in the distance. He stood still, trying to make out what it was. As it got closer, Fred turned to go. It was the last move he ever made. The next day they found him with 10 holes in his chest. This made the town quite worried. They were scared of more people getting killed. So, one night, 2 brave brothers, John and Jacob, went out to get rid of the problem. They each took knives and walkie-talkies. They said goodbye to their father and kissed their grandmother on the way out. The 2 boys decided to split up. One would go by the site of the murder, and the other would wander the streets. If one was attacked, they could use their walkie-talkie to contact the other. So they set off, keeping a close eye on the shadows. Nothing seemed to be happening. It was a calm night, and it seemed like they would get home safely. But then suddenly John heard a crackling in the bushes behind him. He tried to call his brother, but it was too late. The figure leaped out of the bushes and tackled him, gouging his chest with its nails. Luckily, Jacob heard the commotion and rushed to help him. He leaped through the air and cut off the creature's right hand. The creature screamed and ran. Jacob took John to the hospital, and they bandaged him home. The doctors called them heroes, and finally they got home at 6 that morning. Only their grandmother was up, so they said good morning, then went back to bed. Neither of them noticed she was missing her hand. Las car finally gave out. Jeff hit the dashboard in frustration. It was bad enough that the car had to break down, but at night, in the rain, in the middle of God knows wherever he was, it was a fitting end to his bad week. The week had seen his wife leave him, taking the kids with her. He had been demoted at his job and was now forced to go back on the road as a salesman. Now this had happened, and things weren't going to get any better anytime soon. Jeff decided that he might as well try to find a way out of this mess. He considered waiting in his car for another car to come by and help him. The road wasn't often used though, and that might take hours, so Jeff decided to first walk down the road to see if there were any other choices. After walking for a half hour in the pounding rain, Jeff finally came across an old house in the woods. Now Jeff had seen enough horror movies to make him turn back, but the rain alone was enough to override his sense of fear and trepidation. He walked up the winding road to the door. The house looked to be very old and not kept up well, and Jeff wondered if anyone even lived there anymore. He knocked on the door, and to his surprise, it was answered rather quickly. An older man, looking to be in his late 70s, asked him what he wanted. Jeff explained his situation and asked if the man had a phone or some way to help. The old man said he was wary of travelers, but decided that Jeff looked honest enough and let him use his phone. Jeff thanked him and asked his name. He said his name was Joseph Palmer and told Jeff the number of the nearest garage. Jeff made his way through to the phone, noticing that the house looked about as old inside as it did outside, and was surprised that there was even a phone at the place. He called the garage, but they said there was nothing they could do until the morning, and they would meet him at noon at his car. Mr. Palmer offered Jeff the guest room to sleep in for the night. Jeff was a bit wary at spending the night in such a spooky old house, but decided that the walk back in the rain and sleeping in the car couldn't be much safer than staying at the house. He accepted and was shown to the room. The house was adorned with antique everything. Not a piece of furniture seemed to have been purchased in at least the last 60 years or more. Mr. Palmer showed him the room and bided him good night. The man was nice, but the whole situation still left Jeff unnerved. He just tired to tell himself that he had watched far too many horror movies as a child. The bedroom had a canopy bed, one old lamp, a single window, and a red carpet. The house was eerily quiet as Jeff laid himself down on the bed. Quiet, except for a creak here and a thump there. By now, Jeff's imagination had him too paranoid to sleep as he heard Mr. Palmer outside the room, walking up and down the hallway outside. Up he went and down he went. Then the footsteps stopped right outside his room. Jeff waited, yet nothing happened. A half hour passed, and yet he heard nothing except the rain beating outside and the wind howling as the storm blew on. Finally, sleep slowly overcame Jeff, even with his nervousness heightened. Slowly, his eyes closed, though he thought he could almost hear something scratching at his door. Jeff awoke. The storm had passed, and daylight was shining through the window curtains. Happy that all his nervousness was for nothing, Jeff got out of bed and checked his watch. He had slept in until 11:20 and had to leave quickly before the people from the garage got to his car. Leaving the room, he was greeted by Mr. Palmer. Palmer asked him if he had slept well. Jeff replied that he had, though he had trouble falling asleep. Palmer laughed and asked if he was afraid of the old house at night in the middle of nowhere. Jeff admitted that maybe he was a bit afraid, but he felt silly for it now. He thanked Palmer and said he had to leave quickly to get to his car. He turned to leave when suddenly something banged his head and everything went quite dark. When Jeff came to, he was tied to a chair in the basement. The place reeked of horrible smells. Mr. Palmer walked up to him with a large knife in his hand. Jeff screamed and tried to free himself, but only tired himself out. He looked up in horror at Mr. Palmer and asked him why he was doing this and why now. Palmer answered that last night he would have been nervous, full of fear, and ready for any attack Palmer would do. No, that wasn't the right time. Everyone expects attacks at night. But during the morning, people are more relaxed and the fear is low, making them blind to any chance of harm. Jeff asked him again, why was he doing this? What was he going to do with him? And said someone, like the garage people, would find out what happened. Mr. Palmer said that mishaps happen on highways at night, mainly during storms, so hardly anyone would even think twice as to why he was gone. If anyone actually did start asking questions, Palmer said he had ways to discourage that kind of activity. As for why he was doing this, Palmer simply said that Jeff need not worry about that. In fact, he need not worry about anything anymore. Jeff looked into Palmer's eyes as he walked towards him. His eyes were completely black, and Jeff tried to scream. A young couple were delighted to purchase the old-fashioned house in the Stuyvesant Square section of Philadelphia. They moved into their dream home in the winter of 1889, bringing their 6-year-old daughter with them. There was a lot of refurbishing to do, so the little girl tended to go up to the attic to play while her parents were occupied with the house. It wasn't as bad as it sounds, because the previous owners had converted the attic into a playroom. It even had a fireplace at one point, but it was currently boarded up. After a couple of weeks of hard work, the downstairs rooms were finished. The mother, realizing that she had been neglecting their daughter, attempted to try and spend more time with her now, but the little girl seemed distracted. She kept stealing back up to the attic alone to play, exasperated, and perhaps a little hurt the child was not being responsive to her attentions. The mother finally asked, "What's so interesting up there in that stuffy room?" "It's the little boy with the shiny buttons," the child replied. "He's so much fun to play with." "What little boy?" the mother demanded, wondering if a servant child had stowed away in the room. She went to investigate, but found the room empty. Certain that her daughter was just being contrary, she urged her husband to discipline the child. At her father's stern voice, the little girl became hysterical. She kept repeating that there was a little boy, and he wore a blue jacket with lots of shiny buttons on it. As her father listened, he became more and more curious. Formerly a seaman, he realized his daughter was describing a child's sailor suit, complete with the brass buttons. The girl's father made some inquiries about the Cowderleys, the family that lived in the house before them. He learned that they had come from England, bringing their children with them, 2 boys and a girl. The youngest child, a boy, was retarded. The neighbors described him as a sweet idiot child, and added that Mr. Cowderley was ashamed of him and tried to prevent him from being seen outdoors. According to the boy's parents, the neighbors continued, the young boy would often sneak out to go down to the river. The story goes on to say that one day he fell in and drowned. His body was never recovered, but his cap had been found floating in the river. Shortly after the disappearance, the Cowderleys put the house up for sale and, leaving Philadelphia, dropping out of sight. The former seaman's suspicions were now thoroughly aroused. He accompanied his little daughter to the attic and asked her to show him where the little boy came from. She pointed to the boarded-up fireplace. Her father called in workers to open it and then to remove the mortar that cemented up a cavity beside the chimney. As the mortar was chipped away, the corpse of a small boy was revealed. He was clothed in a little blue sailor jacket with 4 rows of brass buttons down the front. Further examination revealed that the back of the child's head had been crushed by a violent blow. The little boy didn't drown, he was murdered. It started with little things, strange incidents that were sometimes inconvenient, sometimes almost amusing, but then the heavy trouble began, and the terror. In the early 1970s, 2 sisters, Lois Dean and Diantha Summer, moved their families into 2 old houses in the middle of Rawlins, Wyoming, a small city in the Rocky Mountains. Lois and her husband and their 6 children moved into the big house. Diantha and her 2 sons took the carriage house right behind the main house. Very soon, strange things began to happen in the big house. Lights kept turning on and off. At first, the adults thought it was just the kids playing around, but they soon found that the lights seemed to be going on and off by themselves, even when no one else was around. Thinking it must be an electrical problem, Lois and her husband had the house rewired, but it kept happening. When the children were playing games, they would leave the room for a minute and then come back to find game pieces missing. An older daughter found the colors in her makeup kits often smeared together. At first she thought the younger children were doing it, so she banished them from her room. But it kept happening even after she padlocked the door. The family dog wagged his tail as though at an invisible guest, and his eyes followed something across the room. Sometimes, in the big house, the bathroom cabinet would be found completely empty. Toothbrushes, combs and medicines would all be gone, to be found later in odd places. Again, Lois thought it was the children, but it even happened when they were all at school and she was alone in the house. Then things began to get rough. A boyfriend of one of the girls was playfully climbing through a window. Something unseen picked him up and threw him inside, against a wall. That was the end of that boyfriend. He never came back for another visit. Not long afterward, one of the younger boys said he had seen something in the garage. Mike, Diantha's 14-year-old, decided to take a look. He started out the back door of the big house and suddenly felt 2 hands grab him and throw him through the air back into the kitchen, into the refrigerator. He had red marks on his chest as if something had scratched him. Lois was infuriated. She began yelling, "I don't care who you are. I'm not putting up with you coming into my house and hurting kids." She was so angry that she was momentarily unafraid. She dashed out into the garage. There she saw a black shape. "It was big and billowy," she says, "and it was dressed like a woman in something black and long." It came toward her smoothly, as though it were on wheels. Something black and cold started coming out of it, like ribbons, she recalls. It started wrapping me in those strands. I could feel their coldness. I couldn't move. She felt her sister, who saw the shape too, grab her from behind and jerk her away from the thing and back into the big house. The sisters sat up all night, praying as hard as they could. The prayers may have had a good effect, for they never saw the thing again. They took to calling that incident the main event. Afterward, they felt the atmosphere to be a little less oppressive. However, everyone had a sense that the place was still not quite right, and before long, both families moved out. In talking to the neighbors, only one event in the past seemed to hold a clue. Back in the early 1900s, a graveyard on the property was dug up and moved to another location. Rumor had it that 2 bodies were left behind. Were these 2 different restless spirits? We may never know. The trials and tribulations of living in today's modern society can tend to wear on your nerves. One can grow very weary of dealing with bills, taxes, insurance, traffic and pollution, not to mention anything about keeping food in the refrigerator. Oftentimes the whole thing can make you want to holler, throw up both your hands, and that's exactly what old Bill Smith did. He gave up all the luxuries and, if you ask me, some of the necessities of modern life. He loaded up just the barest of essentials and his 3 hunting dogs into his truck and moved way up into the North Georgia mountains. Smitty, that's what all of us folks in town called him, figured it wouldn't be that much of an adjustment. After all, he did love hunting, fishing, and the great outdoors. And he did have the companionship of his 3 best friends, his dogs Ikno, Yuno, and Comptico, Calico. What more could a man ask for? Smitty built himself a nice little cabin way back in the woods. It wasn't very big, but it was just enough for him. The cabin only had 2 rooms. One he used for a bedroom, and the other for every other room. Living room, dining room, den, and kitchen. He had built himself a nice big fireplace where he could cook his food and warm his body on chilly nights. He planted himself a nice little vegetable garden on the side of the house and would hunt and fish for most of his food, but at least once a month he would drive the 25 miles down the mountain to the little store to buy those things that he couldn't provide for himself. During the warm months, Smitty had no problem catching as much small game as he needed. But the colder months proved to be a little more difficult to keep his stomach full. Well, it was on one of those cold wintry nights that Smitty went out to his storage shed to see what he could find for dinner. All he found was a small piece of fatback meat and a handful of rice. There was too much snow on the ground to travel the 25 miles to the store, so he had to make do with what he had. He ate the fatback and a little of the rice, but he gave most of the rice and the water where he had boiled the meat to his dogs. After all, they had to eat too. He called out, "Ikno, Yuno, Comptico Calico. Come on, doggies, and get you some of this heya dinner." And those dogs came running in as fast as they could and lapped up all of that rice mixture. Smitty was still a little hungry, but there wasn't much he could do about that. So despite the protests of his grumbling stomach, Smitty stoked the fire in the fireplace to keep the cabin warm, and he went to bed. The sound of the wind blowing around, and in some places through, the tiny cabin had almost lulled Smitty to sleep when he heard something. He opened his eyes and saw a shadow on the wall. He eased out of bed and tiptoed into the other room. There he saw the oddest-looking creature he had ever seen. It was short and stubby, with pointed ears and short fat feet with long claws, and it had a long bushy tail. There were no open doors or windows, so Smitty was confused as to how the funny-looking thing had gotten in. Smitty quietly picked up his axe, crept over to the odd critter who was devouring an insect of some sort, raised his axe, and came down squarely on the creature's tail. Smitty turned to catch the varmint, but he was too quick. It hurriedly escaped through the wall. So Smitty was left standing there with this long bushy tail and a blood-laden axe in his hand, and no sign of the funny-looking creature. Smitty was about to throw the old tail out the door when his growling stomach reminded him of how hungry he still was. So he took that tail, cleaned it, cooked it with some of the herbs from his garden he had stored away, and ate it. It didn't taste that bad. Why, it kind of tasted like chicken. With his stomach finally full, Smitty got back into his warm, cozy bed. Smitty had just drifted off into a deep sleep when a strange sound awakened him. It sounded like something trying to scratch its way into the cabin, perhaps a raccoon. Smitty knew that if he stayed real quiet, it would probably go away. So he stayed as quiet as he could, but then he heard a strange, otherworldly voice which hissed, "Taily Po! I want my Taily Po!" Smitty thought the wind was playing tricks on his ears, but he heard it again. "Taily Po, I want my Taily Po." Smitty jumped out of bed, flung open the door, and called out to his dogs, "Ikno, Yukno, Comptico Calico, come on over here and see what's making that noise." The dogs came running, barking and sniffing around, but they didn't find anything at all, so Smitty put the dogs back outside and went back to bed. Sleep had just eased itself into Smitty's body when he heard the voice again. This time the scratching sounded like it was at the window. Whatever it was, it really, really wanted to get in. But the scratching seemed to be on 2 walls at one time. Smitty called out, "Hey, hey, hey, who's that at my door? Get on away from heya." Then he heard the strange voice again, only this time a little louder. "Taily Po, I want my Taily Po. Taily Po, I'm coming to get my Taily Po." Old Smitty, who wasn't one to frighten easily, was getting a little shaky. This was getting really weird. So he eased to the window and called, "Ino, you know, Comptico Calico, come on over here and see what this is scratching at my house." The 3 dogs bounded up to the porch, and they sniffed around and barked and sniffed, but they never found anything at all. Smitty decided to stay up for the rest of the night to protect himself, his dogs, and his little cabin. So he pulled a chair next to the fireplace, grabbed a blanket from his bed, and settled in for the rest of the wind-chilled, wintry night. Sleep soon overtook him, and once again he dozed off. It was almost dawn when Smitty woke with a start. The sound of scratching seemed to reverberate from every area of the cabin. Smitty searched frantically for his axe, his rifle, or something to defend himself with, but he was so frightened he couldn't find anything. The scratching grew louder and louder and louder, and then the voice, "Taily-po, where is my taily-po? Give me back my taily-po." Smitty yelled back, "Leave me alone, I ain't got your taily-po." Then he called, "Igno you know, comtico calico, come on in here and protect your old master." This time, the dogs didn't come. So he called again, "Igno you know, comtico calico, don't you hear me calling you? Come here, doggies." He waited and waited, but still not one dog came running. Smitty had never been so scared in his life. He ran to his bed and jumped in. The scratching and the voice grew louder and louder and louder. Smitty yelled back as loud as he could, "I ain't got no taily-po, so why don't you leave me alone and go on about your business? I ain't never hurt nobody or nothing, just leave me alone." The scratching seemed to be inside the house now, and the voice was so loud it was deafening. "Taily-po! You took my taily-po, and now I'm back to get it. Give it to me now!" Smitty pulled the cover up over his head and stayed as quiet as he could, but the scratching was now in his room. "Taily-po, you better give me back my taily-po." Smitty then felt the thing scratching up the bottom of the bed and onto the cover. Smitty eased the cover down to see what was steadily approaching. Then he saw it, a short, stubby creature with pointed ears, fat feet with long claws and bloodshot red eyes that glowed in the dark, eyes that seemed to burn straight through Smitty. Before he could pull the cover over his head again, the thing pounced on his chest, looked straight down at him and said, "You got my taily-po, and you better give it back to me now." Smitty yelled, "What, I ate it. I ate your taily-po, it's gone." And that thing started to scratch and claw and tear away at poor old Smitty, trying to get that taily-po back. Smitty tried to fight back, but that thing was too strong, and those claws were too sharp. Smitty's screams echoed throughout the dark mountains, then stopped, leaving a chilling silence. After a month or two, without hearing from Smitty, the folks who owned the store at the base of the mountain went up to his cabin to make sure everything was all right. When they got there, they found his cabin torn to shreds, but no sign of Smitty or the dogs. They searched the woods and called for them, "Smitty, Ikno, you know, Comtico, Calico," but they never found a thing. As the search party was heading down the mountain, the wintry wind began to blow, and a strange voice could be heard saying, "Taily-po, taily-po, now I've got my taily-po." My girl hurried through her schoolwork as fast as she could. It was the night of the high school dance, along about 70 years ago in the town of Kingsville, Texas. The girl was so excited about the dance. She had bought a brand new, sparkly red dress for the dance. She knew she looked smashing in it. It was going to be the best evening of her life. Then her mother came in the house, looking pale and determined. "You are not going to that dance," her mother said. "But why?" the girl asked her mother. "I've just been talking to the preacher. He says the dance is going to be for the devil. You are absolutely forbidden to go," her mother said. The girl nodded, as if she accepted her mother's words, but she was determined to go to the dance. As soon as her mother was busy, she put on her brand new red dress and ran down to the KC Hall where the dance was being held. As soon as she walked into the room, all the guys turned to look at her. She was startled by all the attention. Normally no one noticed her. Her mother sometimes accused her of being too awkward to get a boyfriend. But she was not awkward that night. The boys in her class were fighting with each other to dance with her. Later, she broke away from the crowd and went to the table to get some punch to drink. She heard a sudden hush. The music stopped. When she turned, she saw a handsome man with jet black hair and clothes standing next to her. "Dance with me," he said. She managed to stammer a yes, completely stunned by this gorgeous man. He led her out on the dance floor. The music sprang up at once. She found herself dancing better than she had ever danced before. They were the center of attention. Then the man spun her around and around. She gasped for breath, trying to step out of the spin. But he spun her faster and faster. Her feet felt hot. The floor seemed to melt under her. He spun her even faster. She was spinning so fast that a cloud of dust flew up around them both so that they were hidden from the crowd. When the dust settled, the girl was gone. The man in black bowed once to the crowd and disappeared. The devil had come to his party and he had spun the girl all the way to hell. A friend of mine showed me how to use Google Maps. I'm sure you've seen it. It lets you use satellite images to look at locations all over the world. A few years ago, I was in a car accident. Since then, I really don't leave the house that often. It's difficult, and the idea of seeing a car drive by me makes me feel lightheaded. I was fascinated by the fact that I could see all over the world, almost like being there. I could virtually walk down the streets, and it almost felt like I was really there. I became instantly hooked. It gave me a real eye on the world. I could go to almost any major city, and I did. I'd seen streets in China, Japan, Germany, and England. So many places. I'd even gone to tourist attractions like the Great Barrier Reef and Dracula's Castle. My favorite was to go to random places in major cities and see how many people and animals I could find. The faces of the people were always blurred to protect their privacy, but it was still enjoyable to see them out there, enjoying their life, walking like it was no big deal. She must have good taste, I laughed. I zoomed in closer and noticed the grey bag she carried on a grey and purple shoulder strap. She was walking in a relaxed manner, one hand trailing the wall beside her. I bet if I could have seen her face, I would see that she was smiling. I began to feel a little sad. I let my hands fall onto the arms of my wheelchair and looked at her for a minute more. I wished that I could be there, walking so carefree with her. That wouldn't happen, though, until I died. I was stuck in this chair. I sighed and zoomed out of Tokyo. Enough of this for tonight. I turned off the computer and went to bed. I got up early and decided to look around Paris. Paris was always fun. I liked the look of the city, with all of the old, beautiful buildings and so many people to watch. I randomly zoomed to an area and saw a street, lined with old brick buildings, a few small shops, and an old tan brick church. Ahead was an intersection, and dozens of people walked by. A balding businessman walked quickly past, looking back at an old woman, hair covered with a scarf, carrying a large purse. A curvy woman in black pants that were too tight stared into a store window, and two women led a group of small children around a corner. I spun the view around a few more times and then saw something peculiar. Sitting on the bench at the bus stop were two people. One of them was a young woman with her feet stuck in front of her in a relaxed manner. She was wearing a pair of red sneakers, like my own. I was startled for a moment as I noticed the black pants, white t-shirt and black hooded jacket. Her dark brown hair was tied loosely behind her head. A grey bag sat on the bench beside her, the shoulder strap hooked over her shoulder. This is crazy, I thought. It can't possibly be the same woman. This is a different country, different continent even. How could it be her? This was stupid. It wasn't as if these were live photographs. They were taken ahead of time and then stored. It's not like she was in two places at once. She could just be a traveler. Besides, without seeing her face, it was impossible to tell it was the same person. Brown hair was probably the most common hair color in the world. Those red sneakers were something I purchased online. I'm sure a million other people did too. I shook my head and went to fix some lunch. When I got back online, I decided to look at Berlin. I picked a random street as usual. It looked pretty empty. There were brick buildings lining the streets, looking more like factories than anything else. There were also empty lots, full of long grass and piled gravel. There wasn't much to see at all, really. There was a line of motorbikes and a car with two German flags sticking up from it. After more searching, I found one kid. He looked like he was dressed for school, a jacket thrown over his bag. He was intently looking at some kind of mobile device. I was disappointed. I started to leave, but then I caught something out of the corner of my eye. I turned the view, and there they were, those damned red sneakers. She was standing on a street corner next to some kind of signpost. She had a hand on the post, looking down the street, as if waiting to cross the street. I stared, in shock. How could she be there too? Even if she was traveling, there's no way I would find her every time. Even finding her in Paris would have been one heck of a coincidence, but this was crazy. Was this some kind of joke? Had Google decided to play a prank on its users that used their product so much? It would have been a great joke. I did a quick search, looking for a note about a woman that shows up like Waldo. There was nothing. I looked through articles on strange things you can see on Google Maps, but none of them mentioned the woman that travels the world with you. This was crazy. Had my self-imposed isolation driven me mad? Had I become so lonely that I created a hallucination for myself? Leaving the Berlin image on my screen, I sent a text message to a friend asking him to look at the locations. I asked him if he saw the same woman. Then I waited, hands sweating, heart thumping in my chest. I jumped when my phone beeped with a return text message 10 minutes later. The text read, "I see the lady you're talking about in Berlin. I didn't see her in Paris or Tokyo. Is this some kind of game or what? Are you okay?" I didn't respond, instead returning to the locations in Tokyo and Paris. There she was. She was there, but it was different. She no longer sat on the bus stop bench in Paris. She was standing in front of it, looking for something in her bag. In Tokyo, she was blocks away, squatting down to pet that calico cat. I shivered. Who was she? What was happening? I switched the map to Brussels. It was another city street. It was lined with old-looking buildings, with shops on the ground level, and what I guessed was apartments above. I quickly scanned the streets. They were empty, other than a stocky woman in a bright blue sweater. I did a second sweep. She wasn't there. I sighed in relief. I couldn't believe I was getting so worked up about this. It was nothing but a I stopped, my eyes frozen on the screen. There was a building at the point of a fork in the road, white with a black ironwork framed balcony jutting from the second floor. I hadn't seen her, as I had been looking at the sidewalks. There she stood, standing on the balcony, her head tilted in the direction of the camera, almost like she was coyly looking toward me. My breath caught in my throat. I switched to Sydney. She was leaning against the wall, inside the doorway of a bright blue Carrick's pharmacy building. London showed her getting ready to step onto a red double-decker bus. Her head turned to look over her shoulder. She was everywhere I looked. She stood on a brick sidewalk on a bridge in Venice. She walked across a yellow-barred crosswalk in Zurich and in Hong Kong, and she stood between a Wing Lung Bank and a McDonald's, adjusting the strap on her bag. In each picture, she came closer and closer to looking directly at me, with her blurred-out face. My heart felt like a terrified bird, slamming around inside my chest. I couldn't catch my breath. I wasn't sure what to do. I couldn't call the police. Should I send screenshots to Google? I clenched my fists tightly and closed my eyes. Who was she? Was she following me? Was I following her? I wish I could see the expression on her face, know what she saw when she looked back at me. I wanted to get out of the chair and run. Why is it that the only thing that made me feel free again was the thing that made me feel even more trapped? I had to know. I typed in the name of my town and zoomed into a random street. It was a couple of miles from my house. The gates to the city park were shown in the clarity of daylight, despite it being night here. There she was. There she was. She was only a few miles from my house, standing under the iron walk arch that stated the name of the park. She looked directly at the camera, directly at me. I felt like I might throw up. She was near me, and she was watching me. She was coming for me. What did she want? I typed in the name of the apartment complex where I live. I could see the outside of the building. The parking lot was full of cars, and there were a few blurred-out children on the playground. I searched everywhere for her. She wasn't in the parking lot or on the sidewalks, not hiding between the buildings or standing in the playground. I even scanned each of the cars, behind the bushes, and each of the blurred windows. She wasn't there. I curled tightly around myself and lay my head down on the desk. This place was safe. I didn't leave the apartment anyway. I would never use Google Maps again. I would never see her again. She could stay at the park for all I cared. I smiled to myself and was surprised to find a tear slipping down my face. I'm safe, I said to myself in a whisper. It felt good to hear it out loud. I'm safe. As I said it, there was a knock at the door. A chill ran down my spine. I had a camera hooked to my computer that showed who was at the front door, which made it easier for me with my mobility issues. I slowly reached for the control to show myself who was outside, but my hand trembled furiously. As I touched the control, I realized my mistake. The last of Google's images that I'd seen had only shown the outside of the building. Just the outside. I looked at the screen and saw a woman in a white t-shirt, black pants, black hooded jacket, and carrying a grey bag with a purple and grey striped shoulder strap. Of course, there were those red sneakers. She looked directly at the camera, her face still a complete blur. As I tried to stifle a scream, she raised a hand and knocked loudly on my front door. Thank you for dropping by the archives and listening to our ghastly stories. Don't forget to like, comment, and lastly subscribe. Until next time, archivists, I bid you all good night.